The moment Violet Prescott walked into the Caldwell Springs barn dance on the last Saturday of October in 1882, she already knew it would be the last dance she ever attended in this town, and that knowledge sat in her chest like a stone she could not put down. The barn belonged to the Whitmore family, the wealthiest ranching family in the county, and they had strung up paper lanterns from every rafter beam so that the whole interior glowed amber and gold, the light catching the dust motes that floated through the air like tiny sparks shaken loose from a dying fire. Fiddles were already singing in the far corner, two men with their boots tapping against the plank floor, and a third slapping the body of a banjo with the flat of his palm in a rhythm that made the floorboards hum. Couples were spinning and laughing, women in their best calico and men in their cleaned-up Sunday shirts, and the air smelled like pine resin and wood smoke, and the sweetness of the cider barrels standing near the door. Violet stood just inside the entrance and let herself take it all in one last time. She was 24 years old, with dark brown hair she had pinned up carefully that evening with her mother's old tortoiseshell combs, and brown eyes that her father had always called the color of good river water, clear and deep. She wore her best dress, a green one the color of sage brush in the spring, with white eyelet trim at the collar and cuffs, and she had pressed it herself that afternoon over the iron stove in the small house she rented at the edge of town. She had pressed it carefully because she believed a thing worth doing was worth doing with some dignity, even when the thing felt like it was breaking you, because leaving Caldwell Springs was breaking her, a little. She had spent the last 3 years of her life building something here, a life of small, honest proportions. She had a position as a schoolteacher at the one-room schoolhouse on Prairie Street. She had a garden that grew beautiful tomatoes in the summer, and she had a set of friendships that had taken years to grow into something real and sturdy. She had her neighbor, Mrs. Clara Dutton, who left fresh bread on her porch sometimes without any reason. She had the Whitmore girls, Ada and June, who sometimes came to sit with her on Sunday afternoons and make her laugh until her sides ached. She had even grown fond of the sound the wind made when it came down out of the hills at dusk and moved through the tall grass around her little house. But none of that could save her from the letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago from her aunt in Sacramento, California, explaining in careful, sorrow-filled handwriting that Violet's mother was ill. Not just ill in a winter-cold way, but ill in a deep and permanent way, the kind that doctors spoke about in low voices while looking at the floor. Her mother, who had raised Violet alone after her father died of fever when Violet was 11, needed her. The ranch her mother kept on the outskirts of Sacramento was too large for one woman to manage alone in her condition, and there was no one else. There had never been anyone else. Violet had written back immediately. She had given her notice at the school, packed her trunks, arranged for a neighbor to take her little garden over, and planned her departure for the first Monday of November, which was 3 days away. She had come to the dance tonight because Ada Whitmore had begged her to come, had shown up at her door with tears in her eyes and said that if Violet did not come to one last dance, then Ada would never forgive her, and Violet had not been able to say no to that. So here she was, in her best green dress with her mother's combs in her hair, watching the lantern light swing and the couples turn. She moved along the wall, accepting a cup of cider from young Tommy Price, who was barely 17 and blushing so hard his ears looked sunburned, and she smiled at him warmly before moving on. She said hello to the Reverend Marsh and his wife. She embraced Clara Dutton and let the older woman hold her face in both hands and tell her she was a fine woman and that Sacramento did not deserve her. She danced once with Frank Whitmore, Ada's oldest brother, who danced enthusiastically but poorly and made her laugh by nearly knocking over the cider table on a turn. And then she drifted back toward the edge of things because she was not fully here tonight, not really, and she knew it. She was already halfway down the road in her mind, her heart already tilting toward the mother who needed her. That was when she saw him. He was standing against the far wall, in the shadow between two of the paper lanterns, and what struck her first was the stillness of him. Every other person in that barn was moving, swaying to the music or gesturing in conversation or shifting weight from foot to foot the way people do when the fiddles are playing and the blood is up. But this man stood absolutely still. He held a cup of cider with both hands, and his eyes were moving across the room with a quiet, observant patience, like a man who was accustomed to watching the horizon. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from years of real physical work rather than any particular design. His hair was dark and a little long, curling slightly at the temples and the back of his neck, and he had the kind of face that was not immediately striking so much as it grew on you the longer you looked at it, the lines of it honest and direct, the jaw strong, the mouth carrying some quiet thought behind it that he was not sharing with anyone. He wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers, and his boots were worn but polished, which told her something about him right there. He was perhaps 27 or 28 years old, she thought, and he was absolutely, completely alone. Not in a sad way, not in the way of a man who had been left out or forgotten, more in the way of a man who had chosen his position deliberately and was perfectly at peace with it. He was watching the dancers with something that might have been appreciation, and when old Mr. Greer came past him with a loud burst of laughter, the quiet man smiled, just a small one, but it was genuine, and it transformed his face briefly into something that made Violet's breath catch. She did not know who he was. In a town like Caldwell Springs, where she had lived for 3 years, that was surprising enough to make her look twice. She knew almost everyone here. She had taught most of their children. She had bought flour from their stores and prayed beside them on Sundays and passed them in the street. But this man she did not know. "Ada," she said, catching her friend by the elbow as Ada drifted past with a plate of sweet cornbread. "Who is that man by the wall?" "The tall one in the white shirt." Ada turned and looked, and her expression shifted into something knowing and a little mischievous. "That is Monroe Hunter," Ada said. "He bought the old Beckett parcel last spring, the one out past Crow Creek. He has been running cattle out there for the better part of 7 months now. He does not come into town much." "Does he live out there alone?" "Far as anyone knows, yes. He hired a couple of ranch hands from Abilene, but no family that I have heard of." Ada looked at Violet with that particular expression she had, head tilted, eyes bright. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Violet said, which was not entirely a lie but was not entirely the truth either. Ada squeezed her arm. "You know you are leaving in 3 days." "I am aware," Violet said. "That is not enough time to do anything foolish." "I am not planning anything foolish." "You have that look." "I do not have a look." Ada laughed and drifted away with her cornbread, and Violet looked back toward Monroe Hunter and found that he was no longer looking at the dancers. He was looking at her. He did not look away when she caught him at it, which surprised her. Most men would have found something else to study with sudden interest, the ceiling or the cider barrel or their own boots. But Monroe Hunter simply held her gaze for a moment with that same patient, direct quality she had noticed in him from the start, and then he gave a very small, entirely composed nod, as if to say, "Yes, I was looking, and I see no particular reason to pretend otherwise." Violet felt warmth rise in her face and was grateful for the amber light of the lanterns. She looked away and talked with Clara Dutton for a while, and danced again with Frank Whitmore because he came back and asked with such earnest hope that she could not refuse, and she accepted another cup of cider, and listened to the fiddles play a slow, sweet song that she had always loved, and all the while she was aware of exactly where Monroe Hunter was standing, the way you are aware of a fire in a room even when you are not looking directly at it. It was June Whitmore who finally precipitated things, as June often did, because June had very little patience for circling around what she considered to be the obvious. "Violet Prescott," June said, appearing at her elbow with the particular directness of a young woman who had learned that frankness saved time. "Monroe Hunter has looked at you 3 more times since you looked at him, and you have looked at him twice more and pretended you had not. You are leaving Monday morning. If you want to speak to him, you should go speak to him, because none of us are going to be young and at barn dances forever." Violet considered arguing. She considered explaining that she was leaving in 3 days, and that starting a conversation with a man she did not know was hardly sensible under those circumstances. She considered pointing out that June was 19 years old and perhaps not the authority on matters of the heart that she fancied herself to be. But the fiddles had begun a slower tune, the kind that pulled at something low and real in the chest, and Violet had lived the last 3 years being careful and sensible, and she was leaving in 3 days, and she did not want to leave without having spoken to him. She did not entirely understand why. She only knew that it was true. She crossed the barn. The crowd thinned out near the wall where he was standing, the dancers preferring the center of the floor, and she walked toward him without hurrying, without looking as though she was going somewhere specific, which she understood was not very convincing given that she was clearly going somewhere specific. He watched her come. When she was close enough to speak at a reasonable volume over the music, she stopped and said, "You are the only man in this barn who has not danced once tonight." It was not what she had planned to say. She had not planned anything in particular, which was unusual for her. But it was what came out, and it was true. He considered her for a moment with those steady, dark eyes, and then he said, "That is accurate." His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not feel the need to fill space. "Is it that you do not know how?" she asked. "Or that you do not want to?" "I know how," he said. "I just do not have a partner I would want to ask." Something in his tone made her quite certain that this was not a general statement. "I am Violet Prescott," she said. "I teach at the schoolhouse on Prairie Street." "I know who you are," he said, and when her eyebrows rose slightly, he continued without any embarrassment. "Small town. You have been here 3 years. You came from Missouri before that, and before that you grew up in California. People talk. You do not strike me as a man who listens to a great deal of talk," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "I listen when the subject is interesting." She held out her hand, not for the formal social shake, but the kind meant for a dance, palm tilted, fingers extended. He looked at her hand for a moment as if confirming to himself that this was happening, and then he set down his cider cup on the narrow ledge behind him and took her hand, and they walked out onto the floor together. He had not been lying. He knew how to dance. Not in the showy, exuberant way of Frank Whitmore, who threw himself at dancing the same way he threw himself at most things, with tremendous energy and variable success. Monroe Hunter danced the way he stood, with control and purpose, leading her through the turns with a steady, quiet assurance that she found herself settling into the way you settle into a good chair at the end of a long day. His hand at her waist was firm and completely proper, and she was aware of every point of contact between them with an attention she had not paid to anything in a very long time. They did not speak much during the first dance. The music did not require it, and neither of them seemed to need it. When the song ended and the fiddlers moved without pause into the next one, Monroe looked at her with a question in his eyes, and she answered it by simply staying where she was, and they danced again. "You are leaving Monday," he said during the second dance. "Yes," she said. "My mother is ill. She needs me in Sacramento." He was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," he said, and the way he said it made it clear he meant both things, her mother being ill and her leaving. 3 years is a long time to build a life somewhere," she said, "and it seems like no time at all when you are looking at it from the leaving end. Is Caldwell Springs what you expected when you came?" "No," she said honestly. "I expected it to be smaller and harder and less worth missing." She looked up at him. "What brought you here, to the Beckett parcel past Crow Creek?" "I had been working other men's ranches since I was 16, he said. "Texas, then Colorado, then up into Kansas. I wanted my own land. The Beckett parcel was priced fairly, and the grass is good, and the creek does not run dry in August." He paused. "Practical reasons." "Most of the best decisions are made for practical reasons," she said. "Most," he agreed, and the way he said it made her think he was also agreeing to an exception. The night wore on around them, and they did not stop dancing. They danced 4 songs in a row, and during the quiet moments at the edge of the floor between sets they talked, standing close because the noise of the barn required it, and she learned things about him. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, that his father had died when Monroe was 12, and his mother had remarried a man with a farm in Texas. And Monroe had not gotten along well with that man, not from any dramatic conflict, but simply from incompatibility of character, the kind where 2 people occupy the same space and both of them feel the wrongness of it. She learned that he had a younger sister named Edith who still lived in Texas, and wrote him letters that he kept in a tin box on the shelf above his bunk. She learned that he had a horse named Calliope, which surprised her, and when she raised her eyebrows at the name he said, with perfect seriousness, that he had found her as a foal wandering alone on the prairie in a windstorm when he was 19, and she had seemed to him to have a great deal to say about the experience, and the name had followed naturally. She told him about her mother, about the garden she was leaving behind, about the particular quality of the light in Caldwell Springs at dusk that she thought she might miss more than almost anything. She told him about the children in her class, Charlie Marsh, who was brilliant at arithmetic, but could not sit still for 10 consecutive seconds, and little Rosalind Greer, who drew horses obsessively in the margins of all her copybooks, and would one day either paint beautiful pictures or run a stud farm, and it was impossible to know which. He listened to all of it with that full, unhurried attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually listening, and she realized partway through the evening that this was a rarer quality than it seemed. When the fiddlers finally called a rest, and the dancers scattered toward the cider barrels and the food tables, Violet and Monroe drifted to the open side door of the barn, where the October air came in cool and clear, carrying the smell of dry grass and something faintly sweet from the cottonwood trees along the creek. They stood together in the doorway and looked out at the dark prairie under a sky so full of stars it looked almost too much, the kind of sky that made you feel both very small and very much part of something large. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Why did you not dance with anyone before I came to you? You were standing there the whole evening." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars. "The only reason I came tonight," he said, "was because Frank Whitmore cornered me outside the feed store 2 weeks ago and told me I had been out at Crow Creek long enough that the whole town thought I was peculiar, and that I should come show my face at the dance." He paused. "I do not find large gatherings comfortable generally. I was planning to stay an hour and then go home." He looked at her then with that direct, unhurried quality. "I did not account for you being here." "You knew I would be here," she said. "I knew you might be. It was different from expecting it." He turned back to the stars. "I had seen you once before, about 6 weeks ago on a Tuesday morning. You were coming out of the post office and you dropped all your letters and the wind took them, and instead of getting upset you laughed and started chasing them down the street, and a couple of children from the school saw you from across the road and came running to help, and the 3 of you spent about 10 minutes collecting letters, and you thanked each one of them by name, and they looked like you had given them something." Violet was quiet for a moment. She remembered that morning. She had not known anyone was watching. "You remembered that," she said. "I remembered it," he said. The October air was cold on her face and her hands, and they were standing close together in the doorway, not quite touching, and the music had started again inside the barn, something slow and aching this time, and she could hear the sound of laughter and conversation behind them, all the warm human noise of the gathered town, and she thought about Monday morning and the stagecoach and the long road west, and she felt the stone in her chest pressing heavier. "I wish I had more time," she said, and she meant it in more ways than she could comfortably explain. He did not say anything immediately. He looked out at the dark grass and the stars, and she could see the line of his jaw and the way he was thinking, carefully and quietly, the way he did everything. "How far is it to Sacramento from here?" he said finally. "By stage to Dodge City, then rail west," she said. "Several weeks of hard travel." "And when you get there," he said, "how long do you expect to stay?" "I do not know," she said honestly. "My mother's illness is uncertain in its course. It could be months. It could be much longer." He nodded slowly, still looking out at the night. "I would like to write to you," he said, "if you would permit it." She looked at him. "We have spent one evening together at a dance," she said, not objecting exactly, more examining it the way you examine something beautiful that has been unexpectedly handed to you. "I know that," he said. "Most people would say that is not much of a foundation for a correspondence." "Most people would be right," he said. "I am asking anyway." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the side of his face, at the patient, honest lines of it. And she thought about the way he had listened to her all evening, the way he had said he had not accounted for her being here, the way he had watched her chase letters down the street on a Tuesday morning and remembered it 6 weeks later. "My mother's address," she said, "is Fortuna Ranch on the Elk Grove Road outside Sacramento in Sacramento County." He looked at her then, and the quiet in his face had a warmth in it that she had not seen there before, something careful and bright and very genuine. "Thank you," he said. They went back inside when the cold pressed too firmly on them, and they danced 2 more songs, and then Violet said her proper goodbyes to the Whitmore family and Clara Dutton and the rest, and Monroe walked her to the door of the barn, where the Whitmore carriage was waiting to take the unmarried women back toward town. He held her coat while she put it on, and when she turned to face him he was standing close, closer than strict propriety required, but not in a way that was forward so much as in a way that seemed simply honest. "Safe travels, Violet Prescott," he said. "Write when you say you will," she said. "I will write the morning after you leave," he said. She wanted very much to say something that would hold this evening in place, the way you want to hold a candle flame still when a draft moves through the room. But there was no way to do that, and she had always been a woman who understood the nature of things. So instead she said good night and climbed into the carriage, and she looked back once through the small carriage window and saw him standing in the lamplight of the barn doorway, still and steady as he had been all evening, watching her go. She faced forward for the rest of the drive and held the stone in her chest quietly, and tried very hard not to think about how thoroughly and unexpectedly everything had changed in the space of a few hours. The Monday morning came with cold, clear light, and a sky the pale color of an old coin, and Violet stood in front of her little rented house for the last time with her 2 trunks on the porch and her valise at her feet, and tried to make herself feel ready to go. Clara Dutton was there, and the Whitmore girls, and Reverend Marsh's wife, and several of her former students who had clearly been told about her departure and arrived red-eyed and determined to be brave about it. Violet hugged each of them and accepted their gifts: a jar of preserves from Clara, a small painted watercolor from young Rosalind Greer, a wildflower posy already wilting but earnestly presented, and she put all of it carefully in her valise where it would ride beside her. The stagecoach office was at the north end of town, and she walked there behind the hired man who carried her trunks, and the cold morning air bit at her cheeks and made everything feel very vivid and sharp, the way things feel on days that matter. She did not see Monroe Hunter. She had not expected to. He lived 7 miles out past Crow Creek and had no particular reason to come into town on a Monday morning, and she had not asked him to come, and it would have been presumptuous to hope for it. They had danced at a barn dance. He had asked to write to her. That was the whole of it, the complete accounting, and she was a sensible woman. She told herself this several times while the stagecoach was loaded, and her trunks were secured to the boot, and the other passengers arranged themselves inside. A traveling merchant from Wichita with a sample case, and a steady, cheerful manner, and an older woman from the county seat who was visiting her daughter in Dodge City. She was stepping up into the coach when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the morning street, and something in the rhythm of them made her turn. Monroe Hunter was riding toward her on a tall, dark bay horse that was not Calliope, though it carried itself with a similar sort of purposeful energy. He rode well, easy in the saddle, and he pulled up about 20 yards from the coach and swung down in one smooth motion and led the horse the rest of the way. He was wearing his work clothes today, a flannel shirt and his trail coat and his hat pulled against the morning wind, and he looked less like the composed figure from the barn dance and more like exactly what he was, a rancher who had ridden into town in the early morning cold because he had decided to do so. Violet stepped back down from the coach step. He stopped in front of her, holding his horse's reins in one hand, and he looked at her for a moment, and then he reached into his coat pocket and held out a small, folded piece of paper. "My first letter," he said. "I told you I would write the morning after you left. This is the morning before, which I think is better." She took the paper from him. It was folded small and sealed with a drop of wax, and her name was written on the outside in a handwriting that was clear and unpretentious, the handwriting of a man who wrote deliberately rather than often. "I also brought you this," he said, and he held out something else, a small, smooth river stone of a deep blue-gray color with a thin white vein running through it. "I found it in Crow Creek about 3 weeks ago. I thought it was pretty. I did not know who I was keeping it for." Yes. She looked at the stone in her palm and then she looked at him, and the stone in her chest was pressing very hard now and she was not entirely sure she could speak around it, so she did not try to say anything clever or composed. She just said, "Thank you, Monroe Hunter. Take care of yourself," he said, "and write back when you have the address settled." "I will," she said. The coach driver was calling for passengers. She put the stone carefully in her coat pocket, where she would be able to feel it, and she put the letter in her valise for the reading of it later when she was alone, and she climbed up into the coach. He stood by his horse on the street, hat in his hand now because she was a woman departing, and he had that kind of courtesy in him, and he watched the coach pull away, and she watched him through the window until the road curved, and he was no longer visible. Then she pressed her fingers against the shape of the river stone in her pocket and looked at the road ahead. The journey to Sacramento was everything she had known it would be, long and tiring and marked by the particular monotony of flat plains giving way to the enormous swelling presence of the Rocky Mountains, which she traveled around rather than through, and then the long dusty roads of the Nevada territories, and finally, the slow green descent into California. She was on the road for most of 4 weeks, with a week's layover in Denver when the coach connection was delayed by a late-season storm that closed 2 mountain passes. She read his letter on the first evening, when the stagecoach had stopped for the night at a roadside station, and she had retreated to the small, clean room they gave to the women passengers. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed with the single candle lit, and unfolded the paper and read. He had written to her about Crow Creek, about the way the frost came to it in the mornings now that October was ending, making a silver edge along the banks that caught the early light. He wrote about Calliope and the way she had of looking at him when he came to feed her in the mornings, with a kind of dignified expectation, as if she considered the whole arrangement quite natural and slightly beneath her dignity to acknowledge. He wrote about the way the land looked on the first cold morning after a night of hard wind, all the grass lying flat and silver. He wrote one paragraph that she read 3 times. He had written, "I am not a man who does many things without a reason, but I find myself having ridden 7 miles this morning before sunrise without a very clear reason, beyond the fact that I wanted to see you before you disappeared down that road, and I find that I do not have a great deal of regret about the 7 miles. I think you are the kind of person that it will be difficult to know only a little." She folded the letter carefully and put it back in her valise in the inside pocket, where it would be protected, and she sat with the candle burning for a while before she slept. She wrote back from Denver, using the writing desk at the hotel there, and she wrote 2 full pages about the mountains visible from the hotel window, enormous and white-capped and utterly indifferent to human scale, and about the merchant from Wichita who had turned out to be a fascinating conversationalist who knew an implausible number of things about bees, and about the old woman going to Dodge City who had told Violet, during a long late afternoon of rolling Kansas plain, about the husband she had married when she was 17 and loved for 41 years and lost in the spring, and how she still talked to him, sometimes in the mornings when she was making coffee. And she wrote at the end of the letter, "I have been thinking about what you said, about it being difficult to know me only a little. I think the same is probably true of you, though you are a man who makes it harder to know things, being quiet about them. I think that the quiet is not absence. I think it is more like the creek in winter. The water is still moving under the ice. It is just doing it without making a great deal of noise about it." She was not sure if that was too much to say or too little. She sent it anyway. She arrived at her mother's ranch on the Elk Grove Road on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, and the sight of it, the low white farmhouse with the blue shutters and the big valley oak standing over the east corner of the yard, hit her with a force of feeling that she had not entirely been prepared for. She had not been here since she left for Missouri at 20 years old, and then for Kansas, and then for Caldwell Springs, and the sight of the oak tree alone, which she had climbed hundreds of times as a girl, made her throat tighten in a way she could not have explained to anyone. Her mother, Ruth Prescott, was 61 years old and had the kind of face that showed its history honestly, lines and weathering and a great deal of intelligence in the gray eyes, which were Violet's eyes, or rather Violet's eyes were hers. She was thinner than Violet remembered, and she moved more slowly, and the doctor in Sacramento who saw her each month had written Violet a careful letter about the nature of her heart trouble, which was real and serious but also managed, if managed carefully, capable of allowing a person many more years. Ruth Prescott hugged her daughter for a long moment in the yard, holding on with a fierceness that told Violet everything about the fear Ruth had not shown in her letters, and Violet held her back just as fiercely and thought that whatever it cost to be here, it was right. The ranch needed work. The hired man, old Pete Oakes, was 68 and simply could not do what needed doing, and the winter was coming on and the fences along the creek pasture needed repair, and the roof of the equipment barn had a soft spot that would not survive a hard rain. Violet set about learning, quickly and practically, the things that needed learning. She had never been a rancher, but she was competent and strong and stubborn, and Pete Oakes turned out to be an extraordinary teacher, patient and clear, and he taught her to read the fences for weakness, and to assess the cattle's condition, and to understand the rhythms of the land in a way that her schoolteacher's mind took hold of with surprising ease. And in the evenings she wrote letters. Monroe's replies came regularly, once every 2 weeks, and they were the best part of any day on which they arrived. He wrote about the ranch at Crow Creek with a plainness and precision that she found beautiful, the way a good observation of a real thing is always beautiful. He wrote about the winter work, the hauling of hay and the checking of fence lines in the cold, and the particular satisfaction of a barn that was sound and tight against a January blizzard, while outside the wind was doing its worst. He wrote about his ranch hands, 2 brothers from Abilene named James and Court Delaney, who were good workers and tolerable company, and who argued loudly about everything but were never actually angry at each other. He wrote about Calliope and the river stone he had put on his windowsill at the ranch house, and about the way the sunset looked on the first clear evening after a week of snow, and about the way he had read her letter about the old woman and the coffee 3 times and thought about his own mother, whom he had written to in Texas the same evening. He wrote, in his February letter, "There is a quality to winter out here that I have been trying to put a word to, and the only word I can find is honest. The cold does not pretend to be anything other than cold. The land does not dress itself up. You see everything for what it actually is. I have been thinking that people can be like that too, sometimes. I think you are like that. It is not something I have found to be as common as it ought to be. She read that particular letter sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while her mother was resting in the next room, and she read it twice, and then folded it and added it to the stack she kept tied with a strip of blue ribbon in the cedar box on her bureau. The months passed with a rhythm that was hard and good simultaneously, the way things are when the work is real and the purpose is clear. Spring came to California in a rush of green and wildflower color, the hills turning emerald and then gold, and her mother improved measurably through the spring months, the doctor cautiously pleased. Violet learned to love the land here again, the valley oaks and the long dry summer grasses, and the way the Sierra Nevada sat on the eastern horizon in the clear days like something from a painting. But she thought about Caldwell Springs. She thought about it in the way you think about a thing that has unfinished business attached to it. She thought about Monroe Hunter with a consistency that surprised her. She told her mother about him because Ruth Prescott had an instinct for what her daughter was not saying that was impossible to circumvent. She showed Ruth his letters, not all of them but several, and Ruth read them carefully at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on and her coffee going cold. "He writes well," Ruth said. "He does everything deliberately," Violet said. "What does he look like?" "Tall," Violet said. "Dark hair, quiet eyes, the kind of face you trust." Ruth looked at her over the tops of the reading glasses. "You are in love with him." "I have known him for 1 evening and 8 months of letters," Violet said. "Your father and I knew each other for 6 weeks before he proposed," Ruth said, "and I said yes because I knew perfectly well what I was saying yes to." She pushed the glasses up and picked up her coffee. "Letters are a better way to know a person than most people give them credit for. What you put in a letter is what you actually think." In June, Violet wrote Monroe a letter that was different from the others, or at least different in what it was working toward. She wrote about the ranch and her mother's improvement and the way California looked in early summer. And then she wrote at the end, "I have been thinking about Caldwell Springs often. I have been thinking about the particular quality of the evening we spent at the barn dance and about the months of letters since, and I find that I want to ask you something directly because I believe you are a man who prefers directness. Do you imagine a future that includes me in it, or is this correspondence something else to you? I am not asking for promises. I am asking for honesty." She sent the letter and waited. His reply came 3 weeks later, which was longer than usual, and she turned it over in her hands before opening it, aware of her heartbeat in a way she was not accustomed to. He had written, "Violet, I have been thinking about how to answer this since your letter arrived, and I keep arriving at the same place, which is that I am not good at eloquence, but I am good at being direct, and being direct I would tell you this. I have thought about a future that includes you in it since approximately the 3rd letter you sent me from Denver. I have not said so because I did not want to put weight on a correspondence when I did not know what you wanted of it. But you are asking directly, and so I will answer directly. Yes, a future that includes you is exactly what I imagine. If your mother continues to improve, and if you are willing to come back to this part of Kansas when she no longer needs you constantly, I would very much like to ask you something in person that I believe I already know the answer to but think ought to be asked face to face." Violet sat at the kitchen table and read the letter 4 times. Then she went into the next room where her mother was sitting with her sewing, and she said, "Mama, I think I need to talk to you about what happens when you are well enough to not need me here." Ruth Prescott looked at her daughter over the sewing with those sharp gray eyes and said, "Tell me about Monroe Hunter." So Violet told her. All of it, from the stillness of him against the wall at the barn dance to the river stone in her coat pocket, which she still carried, to the 9 months of letters and what they had shown her about who he was, to the letter she was holding in her hand. Ruth was quiet for a moment after Violet finished. Then she set down her sewing and said, "Pete Oakes has a son who has been looking for a reason to come back to California from Arizona. If I asked, he would come run this place. He knows it. He grew up working alongside his father here." She looked at Violet with great steadiness. "I am not going to be the reason you miss your life. "You are not a reason I am missing anything," Violet said. "You are my mother and I came because I wanted to come." "I know that," Ruth said. "I am saying that when it is time, and I can see in your face that it is getting close to time." Violet wrote back to Monroe. She told him that her mother was improving, that by autumn she expected to have arrangements in place that would allow her to return to Kansas, and she asked if she could come back to Caldwell Springs, and she asked what it was he wanted to ask her in person. His response was prompt this time, arrived in just under 2 weeks. He wrote, "I am going to let that question wait for the asking. But I will tell you that I have spoken to Frank Whitmore about whether the schoolhouse position is still open, and it is not, but that there is a school being built in the new settlement at Cedar Bend, 6 miles north of the Crow Creek parcel, and they have been looking for a teacher since March. I have not presumed to apply on your behalf. That would be overstepping, but I thought you might want to know." She wrote back immediately, "You mentioned it. That is not overstepping. That is paying attention." The autumn came to California in its slow golden way, the hills going brown and russet, and the valley oaks dropping their acorns, and the mornings going cold with a gradual, dignified pace. Pete Oak's son, whose name was Samuel and who was 34 and competent and clearly glad to be back near his aging father, arrived in September and spent 2 weeks learning the ranch from Violet and Pete together, walking every pasture and fence line and going over the accounts and the seasonal calendar. And Violet found that she trusted him, which was important, and her mother found that she liked him, which was more important. Ruth Prescott was not fully well. Violet did not let herself pretend otherwise. The heart trouble was managed, but it was permanent, and Ruth would require the doctor's visits and the careful management of her days and the limitations that the illness imposed. But Ruth was also undeniably managing. She was cooking her own breakfast. She was sitting in the garden in the afternoons. She had taken up correspondence with several old friends and was writing letters with a regularity and length that Violet found both reassuring and slightly competitive. In October, a year after the barn dance in Caldwell Springs, Violet Prescott packed her trunks. She sat with her mother the evening before her departure, and they shared a bottle of good wine that Ruth had been keeping in the cellar since before Violet was born, or so Ruth claimed, and they talked until well past midnight the way they had talked when Violet was a girl, about everything and nothing, about memory and the nature of love and the way a life can surprise you, and Ruth told her things about Violet's father that she had never said before. Small detailed things about the way he held his coffee cup and the particular way he laughed, and Violet held all of it very carefully. "Are you afraid?" Ruth asked her at one point. "A little," Violet said honestly. "I am going back to a place I know and toward a man I am not sure I fully know, though I think I know more of him than most women know of men they marry." "More people should do it that way," Ruth said. "Know the mind and the character first, the rest follows." "You sound very certain," Violet said. "I have had 40 years since your father to think about what mattered and what did not," Ruth said. "The things that mattered were all about character, the rest was just weather." In the morning, Samuel Oakes loaded her trunks and Pete drove her to the Sacramento station in the farm wagon, and Ruth stood at the gate of the ranch with her hand raised in farewell, and Violet leaned out the wagon to look back at her, at the woman who had made her, standing under that valley oak in the October morning light, and she felt the complicated fullness of that moment, the grief and the gratitude and the love, all tangled together the way they always are. She faced forward. The journey east was faster than the journey west had been, the rail lines having extended further into Kansas in the year she had been gone, and she arrived in Dodge City in the second week of October and took the stage south toward Caldwell Springs. The country unrolled around her with a familiarity that surprised her, the flat gold of the plains under the wide sky, the distant smudge of distant tree lines along watercourses, the occasional ranch buildings sitting in the immensity of the land with a look of profound stubbornness, as if they had decided to stay and were not going to be argued out of it. She had written to Monroe with her arrival date. She had not asked him to meet her. She had told him when she expected to arrive and let him decide what to do with that information, which was, she had decided enough. The stage pulled into Caldwell Springs at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday, rolling down the main street past the familiar storefronts, the feed store and the post office and the church with its white steeple, and Violet looked out the window at all of it with a feeling she could not quite name. Not exactly homecoming because Sacramento was home, but something like the recognition of a place that held something important. Monroe Hunter was standing outside the stage office. He was in his good clothes, the dark trousers and a clean shirt, and his hat in his hands, and he was standing in exactly the way she remembered, still and deliberate. And when the stage stopped and the door opened and she stepped down, he was already moving toward her. She had thought, sometimes in the year of letters, that when she saw him again it might be strange, that the person standing in front of her might not quite match the person she had been corresponding with, that there would be an awkwardness of reconnection. She had been wrong about that completely. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she looked back at him, and it was not strange at all. It was more like picking up a conversation that had been interrupted, which she supposed it was. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she said. "How is your mother?" "Improving, stubborn, happy." She paused. "She sends her regards." Something lit in his face. "She does not know me." "She knows your letters," Violet said. "She has read several of them." "I should probably have asked your permission for that." "Did she like them?" "She said you write well and that your face is trustworthy, based on how I described you." "High praise from a woman I have never met," he said. "From Ruth Prescott, yes," Violet said. "Quite high." He helped her with her trunks, loading them into the back of his wagon with efficient care, and he drove her to the boarding house at the north end of town where he had arranged for her to have a room while she got herself settled. As they drove through town, she saw Clara Dutton on the street, who stopped dead and then waved with enormous enthusiasm, and she saw the Whitmore girls driving a buggy the other direction, who both screamed her name in a way that made Monroe's horse twitch her ears in alarm. "Ada is getting married," Monroe said, watching the buggy. "Ada?" Violet turned. "To whom?" "A man named Calloway from Emporia. He came through last spring with a cattle drive, and apparently they got along very well." "Good," Violet said warmly. "She will keep him entirely on his toes, and he will be the better for it." Monroe made a sound that was almost a laugh. The boarding house room was small and clean, with a window looking out toward the prairie, and Monroe carried her trunks up the stairs and set them at the foot of the bed, and then stood for a moment in the doorway, hat in hand. "I thought," he said, "if you are not too tired from traveling, that I could show you the Cedar Bend School tomorrow, if you are interested in the position." "I would like that," she said. "And tonight," he said, and then he paused in a way that was very slightly unlike him, the smallest hesitation. "I was wondering if you would have supper with me. The hotel dining room does a reasonable meal." "Yes," she said, "I would like that too." He nodded, and the look in his eyes was very warm and very steady, and he said he would be back for her at 6 o'clock, and he went back down the stairs, and she listened to his boots on the wooden steps, and then the sound of his wagon pulling away from the street, and she stood in the clean small room and pressed her fingers against the river stone in her coat pocket where it had been for the last year, and she felt something settle in her chest in the place where the stone of leaving had been. The hotel dining room had white tablecloths and candles, and a menu written out on a chalkboard in someone's ambitious handwriting, and they sat across from each other in the candlelight and ate roast beef and fresh bread and drank good coffee, and they talked the way they had talked in the barn doorway a year ago, with an ease and an honesty that felt to Violet like the best kind of luxury. He told her about the ranch, about the progress of the past year, the new cattle and the fence improvements, and the bunkhouse addition he had built himself over the summer with the Delaney brothers' help. He told her about the creek in the spring runoff, which had been spectacular, and about Calliope, who had been bred in the spring, and was carrying a foal with great dignity and a clear sense of her own importance. He told her about his sister Edith, who had written in August that she was expecting her first child and was cautiously hopeful and entirely terrified. He asked her about her mother and she told him more, the good and the hard of the year, the way it had changed her in ways she was still understanding, the way it had clarified things. She told him about learning to read fences and cattle, which made him smile, a real one. "You can apply that here," he said. The Cedar Bend School Board is run by a man named Halloran who is very enthusiastic but not very organized. You will need to read the situation carefully. "I am good at reading situations," she said. "I know," he said. "I have observed that." After dinner, they walked along the main street in the cool October evening, the same season as the barn dance but a year later, the same stars and the same dry grass smell on the air. They walked without any particular destination and talked and eventually stopped at the edge of town where the street ran out into the dark open prairie and stood together looking at the distance. "I want to ask you something," he said. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "I told you in a letter that I wanted to ask you something in person," he said. "I have been thinking about how to say it for a long time and I have not arrived at anything particularly eloquent, so I am going to just say the plain thing." "The plain thing is better than the eloquent thing, usually," she said. "I believe that too," he said. He looked at her with that complete, unhurried attention. "I would like to marry you, Violet Prescott. I have known that since about February of last year, and I have wanted to say it directly for about as long. I am not a man who has a great deal to offer in terms of elegance or variety or sophistication. I have a ranch and a creek and a reliable character, and the genuine intention of making you happy for as long as I am capable of it. If that is something you want, I would be very glad to know it." She looked at him for a long moment in the starlight, at the honest, patient face that she had been building a picture of in her imagination for a year from letters and memory, and she found that the real thing was exactly as she had built it, which was not something you could always count on in this life. "Monroe Hunter," she said, "I have been carrying a river stone in my coat pocket for 13 months because I could not bring myself to put it anywhere else." I think the answer is probably yes. He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile but was warmer than anything she had seen on his face before, something open and real, and he said, "Probably." "Definitively," she said. The probably was for rhetorical balance. He laughed then, a full real laugh, and she had not heard that before, and she decided immediately that she wanted to hear it as often as possible for the rest of her life. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood together at the edge of the town with the prairie stretching dark and enormous before them and the stars overhead in their thousands, and she felt the rightness of it settle through her like warmth after cold. They were married in January of 1884, at the church in Caldwell Springs on a clear, cold Saturday, when the sky was the particular bright blue of a winter morning in Kansas, and the frozen grass beside the road sparkled in the light. Reverend Marsh presided with a warm thoroughness that made the ceremony feel both sacred and very human, which was exactly right. Ruth Prescott made the journey from Sacramento, traveling with Samuel Oak's wife who had offered to accompany her, and she arrived 2 days before the wedding looking tired from the journey but also looking like herself, sharp-eyed and upright. And when she met Monroe Hunter for the first time, she shook his hand with both of hers and looked at him steadily for a long moment and then said, "I read your letters," and Monroe said, "I know." "Violet told me," and Ruth said, "They were good letters," and Monroe said, "Thank you, ma'am." And that was apparently sufficient because Ruth smiled with a completeness that Violet had not seen from her in some time and said, "Good. Take care of my daughter." "Yes, ma'am," Monroe said. Ada Whitmore, already engaged to her man from Emporia, stood up for Violet at the altar, and Frank Whitmore stood up for Monroe, which Monroe had accepted with a kind of resigned affection that suggested Frank's enthusiasm was something Monroe had made his peace with. The Delaney brothers sat in the front pew and argued in low voices about whether the temperature was going to drop below zero that night, which it did not, as if to settle the matter. Clara Dutton wept. Several of the children from the Cedar Bend School, where Violet had been teaching since November, sat in a solemn row in the back pews and behaved with remarkable decorum, given that several of them were under the age of 10. Monroe stood at the altar and watched her come down the aisle, and the look on his face was one that she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Not dramatic, not overwhelmed, but deeply and completely certain, the same quality he brought to everything he did, the quality of a man who had made up his mind and was at peace with it. She walked toward him and he watched her come, and she felt seen, completely and without reserve, in the way she had felt that first night at the dance when he had held her gaze without flinching. They said their vows in clear voices in front of the people who mattered, and the Reverend pronounced them married in the eyes of God and the territory of Kansas, and Monroe kissed her once, brief and certain, and she heard Clara Dutton weep louder. Ruth stayed for a week after the wedding, sleeping in the spare room of the ranch house at Crow Creek, and Violet watched her mother and her husband together with a particular attention and found everything she hoped to find. They were alike in certain ways, Ruth and Monroe, quiet and deliberate and very direct, and they played chess in the evenings by the fire and had the kind of conversations that went on for a long time because neither of them was in a hurry, and Violet sat across from them and drank her tea and listened. When Ruth left, she stood in the yard of the Crow Creek Ranch and held Violet's face in her hands the same way she had held it in the yard of the Caldwell Springs boarding house, and she said, "This is right. You know that, don't you?" "Yes," Violet said, "I know that." "Good." Ruth kissed her forehead. "Write to me every week, I mean it." "Every week," Violet promised. "Samuel and Pete will take good care of you." "I am not worried about that," Ruth said. "I am worried about having interesting letters." Monroe helped Ruth into the wagon and tipped his hat to her, and she patted his arm, which for Ruth Prescott was equivalent to a significant declaration of affection, and the wagon rolled away down the road toward the Sacramento stage connection, and Violet and Monroe stood in the yard of their ranch together and watched it go. The life they built at Crow Creek was one that grew slowly and solidly, the way good things do. The ranch expanded through the first year, as Monroe negotiated the purchase of the adjacent 40 acres from a farmer named Grover who was going back east to his family in Ohio, and the additional pasture allowed them to increase the herd substantially. The Cedar Bend School was everything Violet had expected and more, the children of the new settlement arriving each morning with the particular combination of earnestness and wildness that she had always found energizing, and the school board's chairman, the enthusiastic but disorganized Mr. Halloran, was entirely manageable once she had organized the board's record-keeping and established a sensible curriculum calendar. She and Monroe settled into the rhythms of a shared life with a naturalness that she had hoped for but had not entirely trusted herself to expect. He was exactly who his letters had shown him to be, and she had the same experience she had had at the altar, the experience of finding that the real thing matched the picture. He was quiet in the mornings and thoughtful in the evenings, and he made decisions carefully and kept his word without exception. He worked the ranch with a steady physical devotion that she found beautiful in its way, the way any genuine and thorough competence is beautiful. He learned to bring her coffee before she asked for it. She learned that his silence in the evenings was the silence of contentment rather than distance, that if she put her feet up on the bench beside him and opened her book, he would reach over after a while and put his hand over her feet without looking up from whatever he was doing, and the gesture meant everything it needed to mean. They had disagreements. Marriage is made of them, the small negotiations of two distinct human beings learning to occupy the same space and the same life. She thought he was too slow sometimes to ask for help, too inclined to carry things alone out of the same quiet self-sufficiency that had served him well as a solitary rancher, but needed to expand to accommodate a partner. He thought she took on too much at the school and ran herself down before she would admit it, which was accurate. They argued about these things with the directness they both preferred, and they resolved them with the same directness, and the resolutions held. In the spring of 1885, Violet discovered she was expecting a child, and the news arrived in her body with a mixture of wonder and terror that she had not been prepared for, though she understood she ought to have been. She told Monroe on a Sunday morning when the ranch was quiet and they were sitting at the kitchen table with the spring light coming through the window, and she watched his face move through the news in a way that was, for him, quite expressive. Something opened in it, something long and quiet. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "Yes," she said, "I am very well." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and he said, "Good," in the tone that with him carried all the weight he did not put into longer sentences. She wrote to Ruth that same day. Ruth's reply arrived 3 weeks later, 7 pages long and more purely joyful than anything Ruth had written in Violet's memory, full of advice and memories, and 3 different recipes that Ruth considered essential to the health of a pregnant woman, and also to the general maintenance of civilization. She wrote to Monroe's sister Edith in Texas, who had now had her first child, a son, and was expecting a second, and Edith wrote back with such warmth and practical detail that Violet felt she had gained another friend entirely. The pregnancy was not easy in the later months, the Kansas summer being unkind to a woman in her 3rd trimester. But she was strong, and the doctor in Caldwell Springs was competent, and Monroe, who had never particularly showed anxiety outwardly, showed it now in a very specific way, by becoming even more still and deliberate than usual and finding reasons to be within sight of her at every hour of the day that the ranch allowed. She found this both touching and occasionally limiting, and told him so gently, and he listened and made a genuine effort to allow her to have her independence, which was one of the reasons she loved him. In October of 1885, a year and 9 months after their wedding, she gave birth to a son at the Crow Creek Ranch with the doctor in attendance and Clara Dutton, who had insisted on being present, and proved to be exactly the right person to have there, calm and practical and completely unrattled by the proceedings. Monroe waited outside the bedroom door in the way that the custom of the time required, and when Clara opened the door and told him he had a son, Violet heard the sound he made through the door, a long breath released, the kind that carries everything held in it. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed and held the child, and he held him with the same careful deliberateness that he held everything important, not tentatively, but with the precision of a man who was thinking about what he was doing. The child was small and red-faced and had a remarkable amount of dark hair, and was conducting an ongoing loud complaint about everything so far, which Violet chose to interpret as high spirits. "He looks like he has opinions," Monroe said. "He will," Violet said. "He is our child." Monroe looked at her over the top of the child's head with those dark eyes, and the warmth in them was the warmest thing she had ever seen. "What do we call him?" he said. They had discussed names but had not decided, both of them having opinions and neither of them having convinced the other, which was itself a fairly accurate portrait of their marriage. "Thomas," Violet said, "for my father." She had not said this before. She watched him receive it. "Thomas Hunter," he said, and he looked at the child in his arms and said it again, quietly, the way you say a thing when you are learning the shape of it. "Yes," he said. Thomas Prescott Hunter came into the world with the full intention of making himself known, and he pursued this intention with impressive consistency. He was not a quiet child. He was curious and active and loud about his preferences, and he walked at 10 months and spoke his first words at 11 months, both of which were apparently horse and no in that order, which Clara Dutton said told you everything you needed to know about the family. He followed Monroe around the ranch from the moment he was old enough to follow anyone anywhere, a small determined shadow in miniature boots, and Monroe received this attention with the particular grace of a man who had never expected to be anyone's hero, and was quietly undone by finding himself one. Ruth came to visit in the autumn of 1886, making the journey from Sacramento for the first time since the wedding, and she arrived looking better than she had in years, the long Sacramento summer having treated her well, and she held her grandson for the first time in the kitchen of the Crow Creek Ranch, and the expression on her face was one that Violet kept in her memory like a painting. "He has Monroe's eyes," Ruth said. "He has your stubbornness," Monroe said from the doorway where he was leaning with his coffee. Ruth looked at him with great dignity and said, "That is a compliment," and Monroe said, "I know it is," and Ruth, to Violet's delight, laughed. Ruth stayed for 3 weeks, and the ranch was transformed by her presence, filled with her voice and her opinions and her recipes, and the particular energy of a woman who had been managing her own days alone for a long time, and was enormously pleased to be surrounded by people she loved. She taught Monroe how to make her cornbread, which came out better than Violet's after approximately the second attempt, which Violet considered both impressive and slightly unfair. She walked the fence lines with Violet in the mornings, moving at her careful pace, and they talked the way they had always talked, fully and freely, and Violet measured the space between who she was now and who she had been when she left this woman's house, and found that the distance was great but the core was the same. When Ruth left, Monroe drove her to the stage station himself, and they talked the whole way there in a way that Violet, riding beside them, found deeply satisfying, the two of them going back and forth about the cattle market and the state of the Kansas governor's decisions on land allocation, which they were both following with interest. At the stage station, Ruth took Monroe's hand and said, "You are a good man, Monroe Hunter," and Monroe said, "Thank you, Ruth," and Ruth said, "Do not let that wife of yours take on more than she ought to," and Monroe said, "I do my best and she generally does what she thinks is right regardless," and Ruth said, "Good. That means you are paying attention." Life at Crow Creek continued to grow and deepen. The ranch expanded again in 1887 when the Delaney brothers, James and Court, who had been working the Crow Creek property for 5 years by now, approached Monroe with a proposal to take on a portion of the new grazing land in partnership rather than wages. Monroe considered this for about a week and then agreed, and the arrangement worked well, both brothers having the same pride in the land that Monroe had, and the added investment of ownership making that pride productive rather than merely sentimental. James Delaney also got married that spring to a woman from Cedar Bend named Lucy Hart, who was a fine person and who became Violet's friend in the easy way that happens between people whose husbands are partners. In 1887, Violet discovered she was expecting again, and this time the knowledge arrived with more ease, the wonder still present but the terror having been replaced by a kind of seasoned confidence. She told Monroe on an evening in May when they were sitting on the porch watching Thomas chase the ranch dog through the yard in the fading light, and Monroe looked at her with the same opening of his face that she had seen the first time, still unhurried, still deep. "Good," he said. She was quiet for a moment and then she started to laugh, and he turned to look at her. "You said the same thing last time," she said. "It was the right thing to say last time," he said, with perfect equanimity. In January of 1888, in the cold of a Kansas winter, their daughter was born. They named her Ruth Alice Hunter, Ruth for Violet's mother and Alice for Monroe's mother's middle name, which Monroe had never offered but which Violet had asked about once in a letter 3 years earlier and written down and kept. Ruth Alice was a quiet child in her early months, taking after her father in that particular way, watching the world with dark, serious eyes, and appearing to come to her own conclusions about it. Thomas received her with the wary suspicion of any 3-year-old whose supremacy has been challenged, and then with a protective fascination that settled into something genuine and sweet. The letter Violet wrote to Ruth Prescott the week after the birth was perhaps the happiest letter she had ever written in her life. She wrote about the child and the birth and Thomas's earnest, slightly jealous investigation of his sister, and she wrote about the particular January light through the bedroom window on the morning after, when she had the baby in her arms and Monroe sitting beside her on the bed, his shoulder against hers, and the ranch absolutely quiet outside and the frost on the window catching the early sun and breaking it into colors. She wrote, "I have been thinking about what you told me at the wedding, that this was right. I believe I knew it then. I know it completely now. There is a word I have been looking for to describe the life I have here, and the only word I can find is full. Not easy, not without its difficulties and its fears and its hard days, but full in the way that matters. I think that is the thing I was looking for when I was standing against the wall at the Whitmore barn dance the last night before I left Caldwell Springs, though I did not know it then. I just knew I wanted to speak to the quiet man before I went. I did not know that speaking to him was the most consequential thing I would ever do." Ruth's reply was 3 sentences. The first was, "Of course it was." The second was, "That is what I have been telling you since June of 1883. The third was, "I am going to need a photograph of my granddaughter within the month, or I will be very difficult about it." Violet kept that letter with all the others in the cedar box on her bureau, the stack of them now thick enough that the blue ribbon had been replaced by a wider one. And beside the cedar box on the bureau sat the river stone from Crow Creek, the one Monroe had handed her outside the stagecoach on a Monday morning in October of 1882, its blue-gray surface worn even smoother now from years of handling, the white vein through it as clear as it had always been. She picked it up sometimes in the mornings when she was getting ready for the day, and she turned it in her fingers and thought about the barn dance, the lantern light and the fiddles, and the quiet man against the wall who had been watching the room with patient dark eyes, and the way she had crossed the floor toward him and said the first thing that came into her head, which was that he was the only man there who had not danced. She thought about how close it had all come to not happening. She had almost not gone to the dance that night. She had almost talked herself out of approaching him. She had stood at the carriage window and looked back once and found him watching her go, and she had thought then that she might never see him again. The weight of that alternative, of all the things that would not have been, was something she felt sometimes like a cold draft, there and then gone. Monroe found her at the bureau one morning with the stone in her hand, and he came up behind her and she watched them both in the small mirror, her and him, and he looked at the stone and then at her face. "What are you thinking about?" He said, "The dance," she said, "the night of the dance." He was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "I was leaving Monday," she said. "I was going to Sacramento, and I was going to be a good daughter and take care of my mother, and I had everything arranged and accounted for. And then Ada Whitmore begged me to come to the dance, and I went, and you were standing against the wall looking at the room the way you always look at things, like you are in absolutely no hurry to decide what you think of them." She turned the stone over in her fingers. "I do not know what would have happened if I had not gone." Monroe put his hand on her shoulder and she watched his face in the mirror, and he said, "You would have gone anyway." "Would I?" she said. "Yes," he said, with the certainty he brought to the things he was sure of. "You were not the kind of woman who was going to stay at home on the last night before leaving a place she had built her life. You were going to go say goodbye to it properly." She considered this. "And you would have been there regardless. Frank Whitmore told me the whole town would think I was peculiar if I did not go," he said. "I was not going to prove Frank Whitmore right." She laughed, and he smiled at her reflection. "The river stone," she said. "When did you actually decide to give it to me?" He considered this with the deliberateness she had always loved in him. "I had it in my pocket that evening," he said. "I had been carrying it for 3 weeks. I thought about giving it to you at the dance, and then I thought that was too much for a first conversation. I thought about just keeping it, and then I thought that it was meant to go somewhere specific and I would know where when the time came." He paused. "Monday morning, when you were stepping up into that coach, I knew." She put the stone down on the bureau where it lived and turned around to face him. He was looking at her with that same look, the one from the altar and the porch, and 1,000 ordinary and extraordinary mornings in between. Outside the bedroom door, they could hear Thomas's small feet on the floorboards, heading toward the kitchen with great purpose, and the sound of Ruth Alice beginning to stir in the cradle in the next room, working up to her measured morning commentary on the state of things. "Good morning," Monroe said to Violet, and it meant what it always meant from him, which was everything that did not need to be said at greater length. "Good morning," she said back. The years layered over each other the way good years do, each one bringing its own particular weight and texture. Thomas grew into a boy of tremendous energy and genuine heart, with his father's quiet, observant mind underneath the noise, and his mother's directness in deploying what he had observed. He was 8 years old when he began riding alone on the smaller pasture trails, on a gray pony named Comet who had a spirit similar to Calliope's, and who treated Thomas with the same dignified condescension that Calliope had always treated Monroe, which Monroe found fitting. By 10, he was helping with the morning checks of the fence lines on the shorter stretches, riding beside his father with a concentration and seriousness that made the Delaney brothers tease him and Monroe defend him with a quiet firmness that settled the matter. Ruth Alice was the ranch's most careful observer. She watched everything with those dark eyes and rarely spoke in a hurry, but when she did speak, the observation was usually so apt that the room stopped to consider it. She had her father's quality of saying the plain thing instead of the elaborate thing, and she had her mother's deep curiosity, and the combination produced a child who asked questions that were extremely specific, and then listened to the full answer without interrupting, which was not a universal skill. She developed, at around age 5, an absolute devotion to the horses, which no one who knew anything about the family found surprising, and Monroe began teaching her to ride on Calliope's second foal, a calm and willing bay named Dusk, and she took to it with the ease of someone returning to something she had always known. Ruth Prescott came to Kansas every other autumn, the journey manageable if slow, and each visit deepened. She and Monroe had by the 4th visit settled into a relationship that Violet could only describe as a respectful and genuine mutual regard, the kind between two people who recognize in each other a shared understanding of what matters. They played chess in the evenings and Monroe lost about half the time, which Ruth considered appropriate, and they argued pleasantly about weather and cattle prices and the direction of the Kansas governor's agricultural policy, and Ruth told the children stories about Violet's girlhood that Violet sometimes wished she would not, but which the children treasured enormously. The ranch at Crow Creek became a place that had the quality of having been built for its purpose. Not grand, not showy, but sound and good in the way that comes from real care applied over real time. The main house had expanded by the end of the 1880s with a second bedroom added to the east side and a proper porch along the front where they spent the long summer evenings. The barn was tight and well organized. The pastures were managed with attention. The creek ran clear and cold in every season. On an evening in the summer of 1890, Violet sat on the front porch of the Crow Creek Ranch with a cup of tea and watched the sun go down over the Kansas plain in a wash of orange and pink and deep rose that spread across the entire western sky and reflected off the creek's surface so that the whole land seemed to be holding the light rather than receiving it. Thomas and Ruth Alice were somewhere in the barn with the horses, their voices carrying occasionally across the yard, and the ranch dog was asleep at her feet, and the air smelled like dry grass and the distant ghost of rain coming from the northwest. Monroe came out through the door and sat down beside her in the other porch chair, with his own cup of coffee, and they sat together in the comfortable particular silence of people who have spent years learning exactly what the other person's silence contains. After a while she said, "Do you remember what you told me that first night at the dance? You said you had not accounted for me being there." "I remember," he said. "I have been thinking about that," she said, "about accounting for things, about the things you can plan for and the things you cannot." He looked at the sunset. "I was 24 years old," she said, "and I was leaving a place I had built a life in and going toward a mother who needed me, and I thought I knew what my life was going to look like from that point, and I did not account for any of this." She indicated the ranch, the evening, the sound of the children's voices in the barn. She did not need to list it more specifically. "I did not account for any of you." He was quiet for a while, and then he said, in the low, unhurried voice that she had loved across 1,000 conversations and a year of letters, and every day of the 8 years they had been married, "Neither did I." She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he turned his hand to hold hers, and they sat together watching the great Kansas sky do what it did best, which was to put on a display of light that no human construction could approach. And the sound of their children in the barn was the best sound in the world, and the creek caught the last red light of the evening and held it for a moment before letting it go. Thomas came out of the barn at a run to tell them that dusk had done something remarkable involving the water trough and a perfectly placed step that deserved an audience, and Ruth Alice came behind him with the measured dignity of someone who was going to provide a more accurate account of events, and Monroe stood up to receive them, and Violet sat in her chair with her tea and the last of the evening light, and thought about the barn dance in 1882. The lanterns and the fiddles, and the quiet man against the wall who had held her gaze without flinching when she caught him watching. She thought about what June Whitmore had said to her that night, young June with her bracingly direct view of things. None of us are going to be young and at barn dances forever. She had not known then how true that was. She had not known how completely true it was going to turn out to be in the best possible direction, that the dance was going to end, and she was going to cross a floor toward a quiet man and say something unremarkable, and then spend the rest of her life learning the depths of him, the particular quality of his attention, the patience and the honesty and the warmth that lived underneath the quiet the way water moves under winter ice. She picked up her tea and drank it and listened to Monroe talk to their children about the horse and the water trough, his voice low and warm and entirely himself. And outside the sky had gone from rose to deep blue, and the first stars were appearing over the horizon, and the creek at Crow Creek talked to itself in the dark the way it always did, the water moving under the night in that old, unhurried way that did not require any audience to keep going. That simply kept going because it was its nature to keep going, and always had been. She carried the river stone upstairs with her when she went to bed that night, as she had done sometimes for 8 years, turning it in her fingers in the dark before setting it on the windowsill where the moonlight could find the white vein in it. And she listened to Monroe's breathing beside her as he slept, steady and even, the breathing of a man at complete peace with where he was, and she thought about the whole great length of everything that had brought her here. She put her hand over his where it lay between them on the quilt. He stirred, not fully waking, and his hand turned under hers to hold it. Outside, the stars were enormous over the Kansas plain, and the wind moved through the tall grass in the way it had always moved through it, not in a hurry, not making any particular promises, just moving, as the world does, as the creek does, as good things do when they have found the shape they were always meant to hold.